All right, hello and welcome everyone. I believe everyone here has heard my spiel before about how we're working with Central States this year, at least who's here in person. Everyone online, I'm guessing you're already familiar because you had to register and likely saw it on the website. Regardless, welcome. We're very glad that you're tuning in. We will be hearing this time from Winston Zack about counterfeit flowing hair $50. Yes. Okay, so Winston, go ahead and unmute yourself, please, so we can be sure that your audio is coming through.
Testing, making sure this works.
Excellent. Okay, I will get out of the way and let you take it away, and I'll be back for the Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Newman Numismatic Portal, for having me. Thank you, all attendees, for spending part of your Saturday listening to this presentation and hopefully many other presentations. I unfortunately missed a few that I wanted, but so be it. But today I'm going to be presenting and sharing my research on a particular group of circulating contemporary counterfeit US coins, flowing hair $50 types, first documented in or around 1813. Get to the next slide. There we go. This is my main title slide. These groups of counterfeits, one example shown in the upper right corner, dated 1787, is something I called several years ago, nicknamed the first family. That has to deal with, well, basically family is a group of related counterfeit coins, usually struck counterfeit coins, all made and documented by the same counterfeiter. So you can usually tell that based on stylistic similarities of the die workmanship, overlapping die use. And these counterfeit $50 were one of the first, if not the first, US coins created using multiple dies, obverse and reverse dies, used interchangeably, and thus I gave them the nickname the first family. Subsequent research might end up showing that there may have been some other counterfeits created by a different counterfeiter predating these, but nevertheless, these are pretty early. The first half of the presentation, we're going to talk about this particular counterfeit $50 shown here and take you to rural New Hampshire in a smallish town called Leominster, which the background photo from the photo postcard from the early 1900s shows the rural landscape, again, give or take 100, 120 years ago. And it probably didn't look too much different 100 years before that in 1813. So before we jump into that, I want to set the scene a little bit for what was going on with the scope of US coin counterfeiting accounts by and before 1813, at least based on the documentation I've been able to find in my research on this subject. So that's a 20-year period of history for the first federal US coins being struck in 1793 until these $50 are first reported. It's not until give or take 1803 when the first accounts of US coins are documented. And here we see half eagles and eagles being reported as being counterfeited. The 1801 half eagle shown there corresponds with a report of those same dated counterfeit half eagles in 1803 and may end up, and the example shown might actually be the same one, same variety reported in 1803. The eagle, I don't know, I'm just showing an example of an early dated counterfeit $10 gold piece that is representative of what was described at the time. But then you see over time, a few years later, around 1806, another half eagle counterfeit is reported. 1807, we have the first evidence of, or the earliest evidence, I should say, of counterfeit $50 what was reported was a cast counterfeit drape bust $50 dated 1806. Again, potentially the same cast counterfeit or the same type as that shown here, as well as another $10 gold eagle. And that report was again an 1805 dated piece, which the US Mint in Philadelphia did not strike that year, being reported there in 1807, 1808, another half eagle, 1809, more counterfeit gold, 1810, the same, 1810 or 11, the second documented account of counterfeit $50, again, a cast counterfeit being reported. And then by 1813, so over that 10-year period, we first get a report of these 1787 flowing hair $50. And the date 1787 on this flowing hair $50 makes almost as much sense or no sense at all to the other fantasy dated counterfeit gold, the 1805 eagle, 1801 half eagle shown below. Whether that was intentional for this $50 or not, we'll find out, or we might not find out as a result of this presentation. But this goes to show the very limited number of reports and probably very limited number of produced counterfeit US coins by or before 1813. It was, overall, US coins were generally not minted in high quantity at that time, at least nowhere close to what's minted today. Certainly the $50 had some fairly high mintages throughout this time period, but counterfeit gold or genuine gold, not so much. And you could also see the contrast that no counterfeit early copper coins, half cents and large cents, were being counterfeited, nor were half dimes, dimes, and quarters, or silver dollars, or quarter eagles. Summary, best explanation I have for that is relatively small mintages, not worth the effort to go and counterfeit those, and probably not widely seen in circulation to make the effort worthwhile. But $50, much more abundant, half eagles and eagles, somewhat reasonably abundant in circulation, so it makes some sense that those were the targeted and counterfeited denominations. In contrast to US coins being counterfeited at the time, you had lots of circulating coinage from other countries, Central South America, France, Britain, Spain, or Europe as a whole for that part. But equally so, many of those countries' coins were also being counterfeited and were actively circulating in the United States. Examples are shown here. Portrait 2 reals, reference to Kleberg's publication in 2000 on those. Portrait 8 reals, reference to Bob Gurney's book from a few years ago, Counterfeit Portrait 8 reals, documenting hundreds and hundreds of varieties of just the portrait 8 reals, silver dollars, whatever you want to call them. And an example of some counterfeit foreign gold that may also have circulated here, this French Louis d'Or. I'm probably butchering that. My French is no good, but again, providing some examples and context that there was a lot of different circulating coinage in the United States and a lot of circulating contemporary counterfeit coinage circulating in the United States. Going to very briefly current events in and around 1813, which may have influenced and shaped the reason to counterfeit the flowing hair $50 discussed today, largely the Napoleonic Wars in Britain and France and their allied countries in between 1803 and 1815. The US's response to stay as neutral as possible in that war, because only give or take 30 years or a generation earlier, we had just finished the Revolutionary War. The Embargo Act essentially closed US ports and and restricted imports from Britain to stay again as neutral as possible. And the Non-Intercourse Act a couple years later lifted those embargoes, but with the exception of Britain and France, again, to stay as neutral as possible. The intent was to, in effect, damage the economies of Britain and France, but more so Britain. France was still very much an ally of the US at the time. And Britain was not happy. They relied on the US now and previously in the colonies on goods and materials for their United Kingdom. So they were not happy. What ultimately unfolded was the War of 1812, lasting for a couple years and through 1815, for which 1813, when this event on these half dollars took place, was right kind of in the middle. Again, a war between the US and Britain, fought domestically, largely in the northern states between Canada and the northern US. And that's the history I'm going to touch on of current events in and around 1813. Plenty of other stuff going on, but not probably as applicable to these half dollars, as I'll go into in a moment. So I talked about the date, the year 1813 is when we first start seeing that 1787 flowing hair half dollar counterfeit. And that comes from a note, which I'll get to on the next slide, I think, from rural New Hampshire. Specifically, as on the title slide, Leominster, New Hampshire. And that's the location where it is in, I guess, west central-ish New Hampshire. It's about 110 miles from Boston, shown there on the lower right-hand corner. Boston is a little bit further south than that, but that's reasonably close. And connecting the two was, from at least the late 1700s, a road network, the Second New Hampshire Turnpike, connecting Boston to Lake Champlain, Boston being an important large city in the United States, and Lake Champlain being an important naval location for the United States Navy as well. And this road connected, going through the heart of New Hampshire. It helped with economic trade and export of goods and materials from Boston across the Atlantic, et cetera, et cetera. So an important route connecting all these things collectively. This is a reconstruction of the original note where this half dollar was wrapped in. It was translated, well, first written in 1813 and translated more broadly in 1950 by John Ford, which I'll get to in a moment. But it reads simply as Leominster, Wednesday, May 19th, 1813. This day received of John Cram of Unity, one half dollar piece of the United States coin dated 1787, and enclosed the same with this paper, Francis Chase and Charles Way, present at the time, attest Abner Chase. With an asterisk there in the lower left, that the original letter has since been lost, unfortunately. So what we get are the translations of this letter from other publications. So real quickly, inscribed in the left obverse field of the coin wrapped in this note are these two initials. It initially looks like IC, but I believe that I is just the way J's were written 200 plus years ago. And I strongly believe that those initials are related to John Cram, who owned this half dollar before essentially donating and giving it to Abner Chase for one reason or the other, which we'll get to in a little bit. But certainly it makes sense and is logical that John Cram would initial a piece like this, especially if he were to get it back or take possession of it, just so it's known that it's his or was his. So I mentioned that John Ford was the first one to translate the original letter. I've also been told potentially his wife ended up translating the letter in 1950 in the Coin Collector's Journal. This is a clip of what was published in the Coin Collector's Journal. The same verbatim letter was copied by John Kleberg in the Coinage of the America Conference publication. The conference happened in 1998 and then published in 2000. However, in 2017, 6 years ago, I revised the translation due to geographic issues in Ford's original translation and other bibliographic issues of the characters involved. The original letter was apparently in 1950, very soiled, very dark, had aged a lot. The handwriting was relatively poor for the time, making overall translation by John Ford and his best effort fairly difficult. So these mistakes, not unreasonable, but my revised translation up there in the upper right should be seen as very accurate or very much more accurate. Quickly, I'll go into the geography of the note and then some bibliography of the characters documented here. Just trying to milk as much information out of this note as possible. So at the time in 1813, Leominster, where this note was written, was a town of about 850 people. Unity, also there on the second row, slightly larger town of about 1,000 people, 10 miles northwest of Leominster, and I'll have a map here on the next slide. The people in the note, John Cram, who received this 1787 half dollar, was about 25 years old at the time. He recently moved to Unity, New Hampshire from upstate New York, specifically Jay, New York, as a result of marrying his wife just 3 years earlier. Abner Chase was well established in the area. He was about 69 years old at the time. He lived in Leominster, but owned a tavern in Unity. So presumably he would make that 10-mile journey somewhat frequently. His oldest son, Francis, was a witness on the second to last line there. He was about 41 years old, and he lived in Unity, and at the time was the main caretaker of that tavern. And Charles Way lived in Marlow, New Hampshire, about 10 miles south of Leominster, being in the middle here. He was about the same age as Francis. And overall, Charles Way, I'll just let you know, not an important character. Don't know why he was in Leominster. Don't know why he was hanging out with Abner Chase and Francis at the time, but he was there. He was a witness. Yeah. So there's the map. This one's dated from 1817, so close enough in time. Just showing the three related towns in question here. So John Cram, who received the half dollar, was a farmer and carpenter, which was a common trade and occupation for the time and in this area, a necessity. We don't know why or how he got this 1787 half dollar, but the influence of the New Hampshire Turnpike going through Unity and Leominster probably contributed due to, I'm guessing, trade, or he sold something to somebody and they paid via this half dollar. The second to last bullet is Cram likely knew this piece was unusual or not genuine. I don't know how much physical coin US money he had handled up to that point in time, but he knew enough to question it and bring it to Abner, bring it down to Abner in Leominster, New Hampshire, to have him look at it and ultimately give it to Abner Chase. There's nothing in the letter that says he was deceiving Abner in giving the piece to him. So We think it was very voluntary, mostly because Abner, now that we're on, again, he was a well-respected person in the community. He owned a tavern, which I'll get to in a moment, but it was a very important location for the community. The Chase Tavern, so named after him. And so the Chase Tavern, which still exists, was a social center at the time. Local meetings, news, information, postage was exchanged there. It was your local community center, and I'm sure you could grab a pint regularly there as well. So yeah, Abner was responsible for news and information. John Cram probably gave this to Abner, this $50 to Abner, so that Abner could convey the information about the authenticity or lack thereof of this $50 to the broader community, or at least warn them. That's my hypothesis, but it makes sense given the connectedness of all this information. And Chase Tavern still exists. We have an early photograph here from the late 1800s of the tavern in the background there with the two chimneys. And you can Google Chase Tavern, Unity, New Hampshire, and see a modern day image photograph of the tavern. I think it's a museum now, but don't hold me to that. It's been a while since I Googled and looked up this information. Real quickly, again, Francis Chase was largely the one doing the upkeep of the tavern at this time. Abner, his father, was getting older. They both, Abner and Francis, had tavern licenses, which they renewed through 1837, which coincidentally or not, was the same year that the charter for the Second New Hampshire Turnpike shown there was terminated. I don't know the exact legal language, but I guess they assumed, well, the New Hampshire Turnpike isn't being regularly maintained, so we might as well terminate our tavern licenses. Again, I'm hypothesizing. And he was again a witness to this letter, Charles Way. We don't really need to go much more into detail. We don't know much about him. He was probably a farmer, potentially a sheep farmer, which was pretty big business out here, the wool industry. So yeah. I don't need to reiterate contemporary regional events again, other than to say that the New Hampshire Turnpike here was an important road going again from Boston to Lake Champlain, where our Navy was and fought some battles, as illustrated there in 1814. There was potentially an overland route for troops to go from Boston to Lake Champlain, cutting through Leominster and Unity, where this $50 was received. Boston was also the fourth largest town in 1813 with about 35,000 people, which much smaller than Boston is today. And any town with 35,000 people is probably considered small to medium. So big contrast after 200 years of cities in the United States. I've already talked about what caused the War of 1812, Britain not being happy with our acts to paralyze trade and effectively closing New England ports. So one of the big things connecting all these events together is that the War of 1812, as many wars before it, resulted in most domestic precious metal coinage being hoarded by the public out of fear. Wars create uncertainty, chaos, fear. People want to secure their wealth, and by doing so, they hoard their precious metal coinage, for example, and other valuables, silver and gold, namely. We've seen this for thousands of years, at least in the archaeological record, where hoards of coins and other valuables were left and not recovered by their owners, usually buried during times of economic issues, wars, etc. And so the same thing was done here during the War of 1812 era. And you do not see, or there's not much documented evidence that a lot of precious metal coinage stayed in circulation as a result. I'm sure a reasonable amount did, but relatively speaking, not much. And so the question I've asked myself here is, did the culmination of the war, the fear of the war and the outcome of the war and the hoarding of the coinage, i.e. the culmination of these events, lead to these counterfeit half dollars being made in or around or just before 1813? So let's dive into that. That's essentially the end of this 1813 story, but it's not the end of these counterfeit half dollars, not by a long shot. So we've seen examples of these counterfeit half dollars published periodically over time, sometimes sold in auctions, sometimes in periodicals, other times books. I'm sure there's other documentation out there that I've not come across, but we'll go into the scattered history real quick. So the earliest auction evidence I've been able to find is from a Woodward auction in 1865, where another 1787 half dollar was sold from somebody called Birch and his collection, possibly unique. I have yet to find who the person Birch was whose collection had this piece, why he owned it. Frankly, I don't think this person was actually a real person, and Woodward or somebody may have created a fantasy name that sounded important or whatever and incorporated there. That's not really that important. What's more interesting is that this 1787 auctioned half dollar is listed right there under pattern pieces. Well, I don't know if Woodward actually thought these were patterns or not, but I'll say this from studying other 19th century auction catalogs, thanks again to the Newman Portal, godsend on that research, is a lot of contemporary counterfeits were listed under or as pattern pieces. Now, whether that was due to ignorance and naivety on the part of the auction company folks, or just as a manner of selling the piece, thinking, letting the public know it could be a pattern piece, but the auctioneers, the auction companies probably knew better that the pieces were contemporary counterfeits. They handled a lot of coins all the time, but they knew the counterfeiting issues, at least in 1865 and beforehand. But it was a way of selling pieces consigned to them or offered to them or they acquired. But nevertheless, very interesting that pedigree of selling this goes back over 150 years. There's conversation 50 years later in the Numismatist for a few months, a few issues, back and forth about another piece, I believe maybe a 1787 or 1878 dated piece. John Ford's 1950 Coin Collector's Journal publication. One comment in a 1962 issue of Coin World that I didn't have access to show here. Don Taxay published the John Cram example in the lower right-hand corner of his 1963 book, Counterfeit, Misstruck, and Unofficial U.S. Coins. So this piece was now becoming well known since John Ford's 1950 Coin Collector Journal article. So it was worthwhile to put that piece on the cover of his book. And then some nearly 40 years later, John Kleberg published and presented on the 4 examples in the ANS collection, of which 3 I've shown here in the center. I replaced the black and white images with color images and made them slightly bigger to make them prettier for this presentation. But you can also tell that if you know ANS coding, that in the top example, for example, was donated in 1942 by Waite Raymond, well-known numismatist. The middle one, 1947, by Bolander, another well-known mid-20th century numismatist. And similarly, Byron White donated the bottom piece in 1989. So again, reiterating, these have been known and have been in numismatic collections, likely as curiosities for decades and at least over a century. Right, now the fun stuff where we see a lot more pictures. Everybody probably comes here to see. I certainly would. Talking about variety identification, the known varieties that have been documented, the number of different obverse and reverse dyes. I'll importantly go into the dye evolution of the 1878 variety Z1B, especially in the date area, and I'll compare and contrast an 1878 variety with an 1887 variety, and explain why that's important in a moment. So thus far, or in total, there are 3 documented 1787 obverse dyes. The left and middle example have an 8x6 star orientation, or in some 14 stars, which is 1 star more than the genuine 1794 and 1795 half dollars have. But somewhat more importantly, there's more stars on the left than there are on the right, similar to the combination on the genuine flowing hair half dollars. The third 1787 die has 15 stars in an 8x7 star orientation. It probably wasn't that important how many to the counterfeiter, how many stars were on each obverse die, as long as it looked reasonable, is my hypothesis. But potentially also putting more than 13 stars, another way to identify these as not genuine US coins. Again, just an idea. To differentiate the obverse dyes, usually just compare device elements, star quantity, star orientation, date and number orientation. They're not always perfectly aligned. The closeness or distance of the stars to the text of Liberty. But one thing that the 3 obverse dyes dated 1787 have is that the portrait of Liberty and the text of Liberty have a good amount of field space between them. That's in contrast to the 2 other related obverse dyes, 1878, where the portrait of Liberty is close to the text, and 1887, which is the same. 1878 obverse die has, again, 15 stars, but the number of stars from left to right is switched relative to 1787 obverse die 3, 7 stars on the left, 8 stars on the right. Whether that was an intentional or unintentional die blunder, that's hard to say, but the date is certainly almost certainly an unintentional die blunder, as that is dated 65 years into the future, at least 65 years into the future, when that John Cram Abner Chase specimen was written in 1813. So I'm sure the die sinker was reasonably competent, but certainly they made some mistakes by not perfectly mirroring the device elements, at least in the date area. And similarly, we see the same with the 1887 obverse die in the lower right corner. Again, an 8x7 star orientation, which is fine and reasonable, but the 1887 date makes little or no sense, being dated, give or take 75 years after these were probably minted. So in total, 5 obverse dyes have been documented, which is quite a lot of dies to have been created by a counterfeiter of US coins at this time, probably the most of any counterfeiter of US coins at this time. Whoops. Okay. I also said I wanted to talk about the 1878 obverse die and what likely was intentional die defacement, probably shortly after production, after they realized, oh shoot, we made a mistake. We created a future dated counterfeit $50. This is not good. Fortunately, at least one or two examples with a full date survive, whereas most of those varieties, most of the examples of this variety have at least the last digit, the 8, starting to be defaced and intentionally defaced. And we can largely see that because all the other peripheral die elements, for example, are strong and crisp, but that last 8 is weak and appears to show that is being intentionally defaced by the counterfeiter. We see a later die state here where the 8 is further defaced or effaced from the die. And then finally, what is probably even more advanced die defacement, whereby they're trying to just get rid of most, if not all of the date entirely, because people are probably questioning the authenticity of these more so than the counterfeiter would like. Again, on that last example, the bottom area, the date area, is very weak, almost ghost-like, whereas the rest of the peripheral die elements are still reasonably strong and crisp, even though this example shows a moderate amount of time in circulation, or at least shows a bit of wear. So that's the 1878 obverse die. Let's compare it to the 1887 on the left. The only example yet documented of this 1887 shows a similar degree of date area die defacement, whereas the rest of the peripheral die elements are very or reasonably strong and crisp in comparison, suggestive that the same approach to the die creation blunder was taken between both the 1887 and 1878. And frankly, the counterfeiter may have just felt, well, if it's accepted in circulation, people probably don't care too much about what the actual date is. They just care about the design elements more so, the amount of silver the piece has, or maybe they'll accept it as a full silver $50, and the public will be none the wiser. And the public may not have been all that aware that this style of coinage was only minted for 2 years in 1794 and 95, and it may not have mattered what the actual date was. Again, just a hypothesis, but I realized the date of the 1887 example was weak. I've done some rough outlining of the numbers that I see at the bottom there, and those most closely match 1887. So again, comparing the two, similar date area defacement on these future dated, fantasy dated obverse dies. There's only 2 reverse dies that have been documented, simply reverse A, reverse B. Some of the easier ways to tell the two apart, if you ever come across one of these, is, for example, the alignment of the letters over the center point of the top of the wreath. Reverse A, as shown here, has E roughly over the middle of that gap, whereas reverse B, the left side of the S. But again, plenty of other leaf and berry design elements compared against the peripheral lettering, et cetera, show notable die differences. This is just one example of how to easily differentiate the 2 reverse dies. For fun, and since I apparently like creating timelines for folks on these presentations, I wanted to share how all 6 varieties and when they were first documented, at least in some form and capacity. Obviously, the Abner Chase John Cram example from 1813 is so far the earliest documented example, but it's not for nearly almost a century when the second example is documented. And this example, 1878, is in the Massachusetts Historical Society collection. It comes from the Appleton collection and estate. We don't know when Appleton acquired this example, but it was at least donated in 1906. But it was only seen in a photographic sense and attributed in 2021. So it's been a recently documented example overall. A decade later, 1787 variety with different obverse die, and the first use of reverse B was documented in the Numismatist. We don't know, or at least I don't know, or at least I have not traced the whereabouts of this example, and it's been missing or undocumented for over a century. A handful of years later, relatively speaking, we see a different 1878 variety, this time paired with reverse B, appear in Bollander's donation to the A&S collection. And then fast forward 70 odd years later to 2015, and this variety of 1787 with a new obverse die and a well-known reverse die was put up for auction on eBay. I mean, it's one outlet where you can buy coins, so it shouldn't be too surprising that something weird, random, unusual like this would show up, but so it did. And within 3 years of this example being first documented, 2 other examples of this variety also came out of the woodwork and were documented. So it just goes to show the importance of documenting these things, and more will appear. And then less than 6 months ago, in December 2022, a brand new dated obverse die, this 1887 piece, also showed up on eBay. And I was lucky enough to acquire that one. So in total, 6 varieties documented over 200 years. Why that's the case, how that's the case, I don't know, but it shows, I think to me, the overall scarcity and maybe hesitation on the US numismatic community or broader numismatic community to handle, document, do research on counterfeit US coins due to fears of laws and regulations associated with that. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up with a handful of slides regarding Q&A about these counterfeits, what we know, and especially and importantly, what we still don't know. All right, just moving something around. All right, so how were these made? My hypothesis is they were made via a drop hammer type of pointing mechanism. So what we see on a lot of examples as shown here on the left is die bounce. Die bounce occurs when there's a drop hammer because the weight of the weight of the hammer die on the bottom anvil die, as shown in the example photo on the right, falls down via gravity, but due to that force, there is some rebound, and the hammer die bounces back up a little bit, and when it comes down a second time, there might be movement in the hammer anvil die, probably the hammer die, and thus causing a weaker second strike or double strike on one side. We see this almost always on the obverse from a handful of examples, And maybe there's an example of a reverse die or two where this is also seen, but it's much more subtle. For credit, the photo on the right comes from Dick Hanscom's drop hammer press from his place in Alaska. This was published in 2014 in the Asylum. And it's really a good illustration of a drop hammer press or machine. Do we know the emission order? Not necessarily, not with certainty. I've estimated the most simplistic emission order based on obverse and reverse die sharing. If the counterfeiter worked in a perfect world and it was so simple as this, starting with that 1887 variety, and then two 1787 dies were created. Oops, an 1878 die was created, and then followed by potentially a final 1787 obverse die with, again, shared reverses A and B there, and an overlap of the two reverse dies shared with the 1878 obverse die there on the lower half. Could I be wrong about this emission order? Absolutely. It's, again, just a simplified hypothesis. Again, focusing on the yellow highlighted portion of the table, what was the edge like on these? It was lettered, but let's talk first about the genuine flowing hair $half. Around the periphery reads on the genuine 50 cents or $half, just one time stated all the way around, well spaced, and so forth. These counterfeits, all that I've studied, have used two edge dies that all stated 50 cents or $half, so it reads that twice around the periphery. There are 6-pointed stars between the words, and the S in cents was backwards, ends up being superimposed backwards around the edge. They probably used a Castang machine to impart the incused edge lettering, which was very normal for lettered edge coins and tokens of the time. And here is a photo that I took with an edge ring to photograph the outside perimeter and edge of that edge lettering on at least this one example that not super pretty because it has some old, I think it's tar across the surface and the edge. But if you look closely, especially at the top, you can see a 6-pointed star there next to an O, probably related to or, the word or. So yeah, I like edge rings, photographing the edges of coins. It adds a lot more value to me to the overall characteristics, especially of counterfeit coins. So what's the planchet alloy? Essentially, I XRF'd a handful of examples. They all came out to being D-base silver, otherwise known as billin, which is another word for D-base silver. My guess, I didn't take close XRF notes, and XRF devices for scanning for elemental analysis on the surface of coins, for example, is not necessarily super precise, but it is quite precise. But my hypothesis is that there were slightly different batches of D-base silver used by the counterfeiter to strike these, some with a little bit more or a little bit less copper, resulting in, if there's more copper, a darker alloyed colored coin, and more silver, a lighter colored coin. Again, I still need to test that hypothesis more fully. The number of reported examples, we're just at 20 examples between the 6 different varieties. The most common, if you want to call it that variety, is one of the 1878 varieties, obverse 1, reverse B, with 6 documented examples. The rarest was the recently discovered 1887 variety with just 1 known. 15 examples that I've documented are in private collections, 5 are in institutions, and At least 6 of the 20 have been reported and documented by me in the last decade. And I'm going to hypothesize that there's not many more out there, but there's probably at least 10 more examples out there yet to be reported. Or I'm guessing I'll report that in my lifetime. I'm still young. I hope I live long enough to do that, etc. When were these made? Well, at the very least, 1813, when we have the Cram and Chase example and letter, respectively. That example is shown to the right, is a very high-grade example, shows very little circulation wear, which suggests to me recent manufacture, and thus reasonably in 1812, maybe late 1812 period of manufacture to 1813. I don't know the span of the time it took for the counterfeiter to create all the dyes and strike all the varieties. That time period could have spanned a year or more. I don't know, but certainly 1812 to 1813 is a comfortable time range when these were likely struck. Where were these made? This is still a hypothesis. I don't know. We know that the 1813 Cram example came from a town that is along the New Hampshire Turnpike that goes to Boston. That's a plan view map of Boston in 1813. Boston being a relatively large place at the time, probably had access, or more likely had access to equipment, supplies, materials, skills for dye sinkers, dye makers, and so forth. All put that together, and you're likely talking about counterfeiter or a small group of counterfeiters with skills and abilities that come from these larger urban environments. Boston being a very convenient place. There are several examples of pieces that I've documented that pedigree to the Boston or Boston area. The piece I showed a moment ago with the tar still on it, and you had the edge ring image, came from an old house, so the seller told me, in the Boston area, and somewhere in the attic or something to that effect, and it could be traced back to at least the early 1900s. So yeah, again, strong hypothesis to me that these were made in and around the Boston area, but there's no smoking gun evidence that I've come across to directly tie it to Boston or to who made these. This would be a huge breakthrough and goal of my research to identify one or more of the players, whoever was involved in making these. Will we ever find out? I don't know, but I'm hopeful. I hope there's more documents and records on the early history of Boston, other news reports, other local meeting information that I would love to examine, but I just haven't yet. But certainly someone with, again, experience making dyes and quality dye production would be more likely to be in the Boston area. Did these circulate? Well, the Abner Chase and John Cram example clearly didn't, because it was wrapped in a note for 150 years before John Ford got to it, so that was preserved. But there are a handful of examples that do show fairly advanced circulation wear. Now, the question is, did these circulate actually in circulation being used as money? Or were people a little smarter and they quickly plucked these out of circulation? The last person with them was stuck with them, and some of these may have become pocket pieces over time. I don't know one way or the other, possibly a combination of the two. The fun part about the characteristics of a handful of examples documented were these detected as counterfeits at the time? Yes, or at least they were being tested to determine their authenticity by these period era wedge chop marks, possibly using just a simple chisel to hammer into the edge of the coin to see if these were just silver plated with a debased, say, copper alloy ore in the center. I don't know 200 or so years ago if these passed the counterfeit detector test or not, but I would assume some certainly passed, because being fresh coins being checked at the time, what you would have seen was a silver or silver-like alloy in the middle, again, being a debased silver or fill-in type alloy for the planchets. But yeah, several examples show these wedge-like edge marks. These are also found on a handful of counterfeit portrait 8 reals at the very least, from what I've seen, and probably other denominations as well, both from the late 1700s and early 1800s. Why were these made? So I'm just going to hypothesize here based on the culmination of all the events going on, the lack of a lot of hard currency and coinage in circulation, especially your common everyday silver coinage in circulation. These were possibly made as a way to supplement the lack of coinage in circulation, and thus could be generally termed as emergency money. For example, we see 25 or so years later, during the Panic of 1837 period, hundreds of varieties of die-struck counterfeit bust half-dollar coins being produced during the worst economic crisis the US had faced up until that point in time. Hundreds of varieties, double or triple that in terms of dies used. And that was almost certainly a response to that Panic of 1837 economic crisis. Thus, why not have a parallel issue and response here during the Panic or War of 1812 period, when the same type of coinage left circulation out of fear and panic? So that's my hypothesis. If we knew who made these, maybe we could figure out why they were made. But again, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis, that these were, at least in part, some emergency money for the broader public to use. And the public could simply set the coins aside, these counterfeit coins aside, after the economy came back, after the War of 1812 ended, in or around 1815. So, big question I get asked all the time in my research is, why the dates 1787, or also 1878 and 1887? Well, 1878 and 1887 were likely unintentional die sinking errors. I like to think they were having a little bit too much to drink at the time and weren't paying as close attention as they should have. The 1787 date has unknown significance. Certainly, die maker was good enough to create device punches, number punches, consistent with when the genuine were made, 1794 and 1795. But maybe there was a bigger significance, potentially, hypothetically, to the state coinage from a few decades earlier, where a lot of state coinage was made dated 1787, as shown in the example to the right. But again, I cannot prove that. Maybe there was some relationship between the counterfeiter and them being involved in making that state coinage. I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns still and a lot of important information that I'd like for gaps to be filled in with that research. Oh, that's pretty much it. I'm showing off my collection of 4 of the 6 varieties there, still missing 2 others. hopefully one day I can fill those 2 spaces and have a complete collection, or whatever constitutes a complete collection of these counterfeit half dollars. Yeah, and I'm always willing and interested in taking in new information, new questions, adding to the research. I have a website. I am working on the next book publication, which will include these counterfeit half dollars and silver dollars. I just finished another book, yes, shameless plug, on the small denomination US silver coins, 3-cent silver to 25 cents. But again, you can reach me at my contact information below. Now my throat's a little dry, but I'm willing to and open to taking questions. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you. We can get the lights in the room here. Okay, so Winston, I'm gonna have you go ahead and stop your screen share. So at the top of the screen, there's a red button that says stop share.
Stop share. Got it.
Excellent. Let me get our screen in the room. There we go. All right, then we are going to do a Q&A. If you are watching online, there's a button at the bottom of the Zoom window that says Q&A. You can click on that and send in your question. I will read them off anonymously, so no need to worry about checking that box. Otherwise, for those of you in the room, please do be sure that you speak up if you ask a question, to be sure our microphone here picks up your voice. So we have one question on Zoom already, and then we'll open it up to the room. What sparked your interest in counterfeit coins?
The abbreviated version is I just finished grad school. I loved doing research. My background's in archaeology and geology, so I like history. I've been into numismatics since the age of 5, so that's nearly 30 years. And I wanted to somehow combine research and numismatics together. The topic of counterfeit US coinage is what I largely focus on, and the topic of counterfeit US coinage had only been briefly studied and published. You have Keith Davignon's book on cap bust half dollars. A few years earlier, I wrote a starter chapter on counterfeit 3-cent silvers with Kevin Flynn. And I really wasn't satisfied with the completeness of information on this subject. So I decided naively a little bit that I wanted to document and research everything on counterfeit circulating US coinage from half cents all the way up to $20 gold pieces. And I'm give or take halfway through that research effort, started nearly a decade ago, and hopefully I keep up with this for years and years and years to follow. It's fun, interesting stuff, and I'm learning a lot, and a lot of other people are learning a lot along the way. So it's fun. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any questions in the room?
Yeah, so Winston, 2 comments. The reference in the 1865 Woodward catalog to birch may be a reference to the Philadelphia auction house, Thomas Birch. So I would definitely go look in Thomas Birch auction catalogs for the period to see if there's one in there. And secondly, on the identity of the counterfeiter, I would check the newspaper archive sites and look in the Boston papers for counterfeiters for that time period. So I'm not sure there were some, so I'm gonna get some information there.
Yeah, that's great to know, the Philly auction house. I definitely did not know of that, so absolutely thank you. A lot of my research has focused on newspaper.com, especially given that you can just do a search for keyword search and try to find whatever information you need. Maybe I need to spend several more hours and more closely doing more proper keyword searches, but yes, I'm very familiar with that. And I I think I have more research to do, so thank you.
Okay, we have one more on Zoom and then we'll come back to the room. Have you attempted to put together a variety set of any other series?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a really passionate collector, especially of 3-cent silver counterfeit varieties, cap bust $50, and I recently completed a small but important collection of 4 die-struck bust dime counterfeits, all from the same counterfeiter. And then I dabble in a broader series, gold counterfeit US coins, especially the $5 and $10 pieces that were especially made that I showed at the start of the presentation in the early 1800s are really fascinating and interesting, but they're very difficult to find. But overall, a lot of these counterfeit varieties are very rare, but it's also just important to document whatever exists, just to recreate the past and create connections and try to learn from that. So, yep, I collect as much as I research, and I think there's a good balance to both of those. Thanks.
All right, we had one in the room, I believe.
Yeah, the word counterfeit. I went to another lecture a couple of years ago, and you're not allowed to own counterfeit. What's the law on that? You have to say it a different word. I think they used a different word, and then I have another question. Instead of word counterfeit, are you allowed to keep counterfeit? I know there's all kinds of laws. What are the laws on that?
Oh, I don't want to plug my first book, but I do have a chapter on the evolution of the legality of making and also owning counterfeit US coinage. Essentially, it comes down to, forget the name of the law, but it's from, I think, the 1970s, that any counterfeit US coin made before that law in the 1970s, you can own so long as your intent for ownership, including buying and selling, is not to defraud the public. And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing the legal terminology a little bit, but counterfeit coins made after that law require stamping the word copy on the coin. Those pieces are usually not made for circulation. Those that we see on the bourse floor or on eBay or elsewhere, probably coming from China or elsewhere. They're not following the US law to stamp the word copy, but I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit, but it's perfectly legal to own these older circulating counterfeits, so long as, at least if you know they're not genuine, i.e. counterfeit, imitations, spurious, whatever word you want to use, at least make an effort to document that they're not genuine, so that, say you pass away, which we all will, your relatives will know what to do with your coin collection and know, hey, this handful of stuff is not genuine, but maybe you put a note with that saying legal to own, but hey. Whereas the more modern stuff, I stay away from that because it's out of the scope of this topic and research. So hopefully that more than covered answering your question.
It did, because the date 1970, that was brought up. And also, I guess China is into, I went to another lecture, and China is into counterfeiting coins massively. We had a lecture that you can go over there and buy a lot of counterfeit coins or have them made for you. So that was the question. And I just thank you for the words. I appreciate it. Very good lecture.
Yeah,
Very.
I appreciate it. I'll just also add Jack Young in particular. If you don't know the name, he's been doing a lot of work, research and publishing and sharing on at least the more recently made counterfeit coinage, most or all of it coming from places like China. And he's a great resource for the hobby in sharing that information. So my plug for him.
All right, we don't have anything else on Zoom at the moment, so if you are online, go ahead and send any last questions in now. Otherwise, anything else in the room? Not seeing any hands, so I'll go ahead and wrap us up, and if any questions have come in by the end, we'll come back to them. So all of the presentations in this room are being recorded. Everything involved in the symposium is being recorded, and those recordings will be available on the NNP about 2 weeks from today. If you are registered for the symposium, which should be everyone online, you will receive an email when those recordings are available. If you are here in person and would like to receive an email when they're up, we invite you to register. It takes about 2 minutes and is entirely free. There is a QR code as well as the direct link on the sign over here and the one outside the door as well. So if otherwise, there will be an announcement on our website and social media when those recordings are up as well. So that's it for this one. We have our next presentation starting at 4 p.m. Central. So we will invite you to come back from that. We will have Stephen Petty speaking on lessons learned from the sale of a seeded dollar collection. So that's all I have. Thank you so much, Winston, for taking the time out to speak, and hope to see some familiar faces or names in the next session.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.